So there I was, looking for podcast-esque videos to throw on while adventuring in the lands between, when I saw that Shadiversity had posted a video on Elden Ring lore 5 days ago. Needless to say, its reception wasn't great, and there was a lot more backlash than his other criticism videos. I'd like to weigh in my 2 cents into the discussion, along with some musings about Souls lore in general. If you want the TLDW, I don't take issue with his statements, but I also don't necessarily agree. Now, due to the expedient nature of response videos, I'm going to skip the rest of the editing process by looping the Elden Ring opening cutscene for the rest of the video. Take that as you will, and I'm sure both sides of the argument can find humor in this decision. Souls-likes are a genre defined by a number of things: build diversity, a post-apocalyptic feel, action-adventure, most prominently their coveted difficulty, which we'll return to later, but what is most pertinent to this discussion is their cryptic lore and world building. For longtime fans of the genre, the lore is one of the most interesting parts of Souls-likes, evident from the popularity of Vadivedya's lore dives. Part of this is simply that the storytelling is compelling, but I believe that the other component of this intrigue draws from the treasure hunt nature of the lore. You get snippets of the lore through obscure dialogue and descriptions, and piecing together the story is an achievement. Others have likened this to an archaeological dig, and to an extent, I agree. Now, from what I've gathered, Shad's issue is not with the style of storytelling as a whole. Shad's main gripe seems to be that there's not enough bits and pieces of the story presented in a clear manner to get players into the archaeological dig in the first place. To reiterate, the issue isn't with the style of the lore, but that within the confines of that style, the information presented isn't sufficient to prompt further investigation. This irritation comes from his belief that the Elden Ring story is masterclass, likening it to Lord of the Rings, from which Elden Ring took heavy inspiration. Before I address this statement, I'd first like to address the comments that have generally popped up. First is a style of comments that takes one thing that Shad said and critiquing it, many of which were met with irritation by the person in question. Of course, angry meets angry in an additive manner, so the flame was out in full force. But something I've noticed was that these were statements that were often incongruous with the main points that I've outlined. Now, if this were an essay and there were cop-out statements like this, then they'd probably be marked up with red ink. But I more or less assume that the guy just goes off the cuff, so it's more forgivable. Plus, he's an Aussie, so he's a bit more upfront and honest, which I can respect, but some might misconstrue that nature as inflammatory. Shad thinks he's being misrepresented and responds somewhat rudely in turn. That doesn't surprise me at all. Misrepresentation of points makes a dialogue feel like 2 separate monologues, and the most well-mannered people I've known have turned sour from misrepresenting their arguments. So overall, that's just an unfortunate situation. The other type of comment I've seen a lot takes issue with the term objective. Many people seem to think that objective standards invalidate subjective enjoyment, which is not at all the case. For example, I would say that The Force Awakens is an objectively bad film due to its character arcs going nowhere, the failure to suspend disbelief, and contradicting previously established world building. None of that means that you cannot enjoy The Force Awakens. However, that does mean that under criteria laid out, it would be strange for you to say that the character arcs were well developed or nuanced. The only argument that could be made against this objectivity is that the criteria are flawed. That is what I am going to argue. Shad believes that the masterclass story is hidden behind obscurity without good reason, and that leaving it more accessible through having key details given would draw in more players. He refers to what FromSoft has done as shooting itself in the foot. I disagree, on the premise that Souls-likes do not promote their stories, and that the audience largely doesn't care about the story. Since Demon's Souls, FromSoft has had a reputation of creating games that are true tests of skill, with the get good mindset doubling as gatekeeping and a rite of passage. This reputation is what people now think of when they buy a Souls-like, and the story is a second thought. compared to the 12 million and climbing sales of Elden Ring, VaatiVidia's preliminary lore video has 3 million views. Assuming that there were no repeat views, which is ludicrous mind you, 75% of the player base didn't care to go to the most well-known lore tuber on Souls-likes. I believe that players are drawn to FromSoft games almost exclusively due to the gameplay loop, rather than the story, no matter how good it may be. Of course, this doesn't mean that 25% is insignificant, and it also doesn't mean that there are numerous new faces that don't know of VaatiVidia. I'm just making the argument that lore isn't a major factor in the majority of the player base's experience. Neither is finding lore within the games, because, as is apparent by now, finding lore in a Souls-like is a lengthy process, and you have to run through item descriptions and dialogue with a fine comb. In fact, how many players actually do the archaeological dig to find lore in the first place? I'd wager that most just watch a handful of dedicated people, like Vaati, do the digging and appreciate what was excavated, without wanting to do the digging themselves. You can write this off as pure conjecture, but I don't personally believe that making key story points apparent to the player would incite more interest in lore digging. Now, should key story points be placed anyway? There is an argument to be made, but as far as the quest goes, you are given all the information you need in line with the Souls game. You have the mainline bosses, and the object of power for which the player is striving towards. There was a comment by Oz and Shad that I'd like to address on this matter, which is that previous installments gave more context in their opening cutscene, which is true to an extent. Objectively, the Dark Souls opening cinematic gives more context to their entire story than Elden Ring's does for its story. Not to an extent which is significant, I'd argue, in that if you had one or two lines saying, Marika was granted the Elden Ring by the Greater Will, and brought forth an age of prosperity, then they'd function identically with respect to their larger stories. And why I have little issue with Shad's argument is that these one or two lines are basically his proposal. How this context gets implemented doesn't matter, as long as the player is assured to get it, and that it is sufficiently enticing for the player base to seek out the rest of the story, which Shad likes so much. I don't think that adding these bits of context would affect any part of the gameplay or story at all, and the experience would be identical. That is also why I don't believe that they're necessary. As I stated before, I believe that very few players play Elden Ring for the story, and I also don't believe that the key context that Shad wants to be included would be sufficient to prompt further exploration. Would it hurt? No, but I don't think that it would help either, which is why I can't call it an objective failing. Now, there's a lot of questions that arise with regards to what Shad calls essential plot points. If he means the spoilers he gave about Queen Marika, then I don't believe that they should be given freely. I don't think he would argue that they should be given freely. It's a bit of a gray area that we just don't know unless Shad tells us word for word what he believes are the essential plot points, because for the purpose of the game, the essential plot points, I'd argue, are more or less given. If he wants to argue the main plot points for the entire story, that needs more clarification. Overall, I don't think it was FromSoft's objective to tell the story. I think it was a bonus and a way to have coherent and consistent world building. As a side note, I can't speak on George R.R. Martin's influence on this story because I've never read his works. But the fact that all the shard bearers and a frightening amount of key characters are christened after his initials is absolutely hilarious to me. As in, I imagine they paid him millions to walk into a design room, slap his fat schlong onto the table, and tell all the developers to name the main characters after his initials, and then just left, and they just put his name on the branding. But going off of the criteria that Shad has set, which is getting players to be interested in the bosses and seek out the larger story, I think Elden Ring is doing just fine. The series crafters are doing what they do best, and the ones who don't care still don't, and I'm convinced that no amount of impeccable storytelling beats, and little breadcrumbs that you can lay in front of them could intrigue them at all. As a conclusion of sorts to sound more coherent, I don't believe that Shad's suggestion would affect Elden Ring one way or another. There are literally no downsides that I can think of to doing it. By the same token, I don't think it would have the results that he believes it would, and that his experience with the story is fairly unique in that most players don't need to understand the story to play the game religiously.